So, you know, you don't have every microbe from the entire Earth in your clean room when you're putting together spacecraft. So we have a good inventory of the kind of things that are in clean rooms. In addition, it turns out that mostly they are human-associated things. You know, we're building and touching the spacecraft. So we have a known set of information. And we have data now, as I said, going way back. And at the time, NASA was working on some of these with the Viking mission in the 70s, and even back into the Apollo mission, we had different views about microbes. But what we do also is, in addition to cleaning and sterilizing, we also keep track of what's there, and we know that we're not, we're not causing an evolutionary change that quickly in just cleaning something. And the idea also is that once they get on the spacecraft and are sealed up, the microbes are also exposed to the conditions during launch and cruise and re-entry at the other end. So the probability that a microbe will survive until it gets onto the planet and then get, popped off the spacecraft into the surface, which is highly oxidizing and has very strong radiation. The probability that something would spread is minimal, but not impossible. The thing that we're more worried about is something like a spacecraft that might have nuclear materials on board that could melt through something. So the ices are real important because now you've created a small warm pond. So that's why also the planetary protection considerations up on Europa. They're very similar to the kinds of questions that we're trying to be careful about when we go into Lake Vostok down in the Antarctic as well. You don't want to bring things in to mess up your science. So the evolutionary part is not so much a worry from a few spacecraft missions, but over the long term, you're onto a question that is of importance. Question up here?
You mentioned earlier life as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
How are astrobiologists preparing if you happen to find life, but it's not recognizable as life? How would you be able to first tell that it is sort of life, and that is not our definition? And two, how would you handle that if you were in?
Okay, we had to deal with that in this whole protocol development series. We said, what is it that you're going to look for? You're not looking for monkeys and elephants, you're looking for something else. And in fact, what you're looking for is biochemistry. So you need to say, what is it that you're looking for? If you look at the whole periodic table, the biosignatures don't associate with every single element in the table. There are certain of them, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, that are more associated with life than others. So you might look preferentially for that. We also know that life is really chemistry in a bag, in a membrane of some sort. So we might look for structure. So there's a whole set of questions that we went through to say, how do you do your life detection and what instruments do you want to use? Subsequently, we said, what kind of other possibilities are there? What would you look for? And so the idea is not to just look for life as we know it, but to look for anything else that might be, say, structural or a homogeneous situation inside of a heterogeneous mix of things. But it's very, very difficult because also you're not looking necessarily for life. You could be looking for a fossil. So, but these are the very questions that will get asked. And that's why you want to keep everything in the glove boxes and then have a set of biologists and scientists who are asking what should the criteria for release be. And that's exactly what the Center for Disease Control does when they're asking about containment. They'll bring a microbe, an unknown microbe, and they'll put it first in biosafety level 4, BSL4. Then they'll start to do the test. As they get more information, then they'll say, well, this doesn't seem like it's an aerosol spread. Nothing seems to be a problem. Let's reduce it to biosafety level 3. So you just follow protocols as you know for life as we know it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just a question. So you're talking about biology possibly separated by space, planet to planet. But what about temporally? Because I'm wondering about like the drilling Vostok now, and we'll bring up sample I assume in a year or so.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean that's an environment that I don't know how long it's been separate from the rest of the planet's environment. But I mean, is that treated as a biohazard coming out? Or
It's interesting.
Do you know what the protocol is for that?
It hasn't been treated as a biohazard from an environmental and planetary perspective, but it can be treated that way for human health. So for instance, when a biologist, a microbiologist goes into a cave to look for organisms, and there's really unusual things in caves, they actually wear full respirators. They have medical testing when they're down there. They're finding snotsicles. These are organisms that are hanging down like stalagmites and stalactites, but microbes. They're finding really odd things, and so this is part of the extremophile studies here. So those people do the protection for themselves, which we would do too. That's part of a protocol. How do you train people? How do you outfit them? But we're not concerned about the spread. It's more for the science that we're interested in it. And likewise with Vostok, the concern is, so Vostok has an ocean of water that has been under this icy cap, and the presumption was that this lake is really unique. And things have been separated for tens of thousands of years and longer, perhaps millions. We don't know for sure. But now what we've also found by looking at research on Antarctica, what they've found is with orbiting spacecraft, they can watch the ices go up and down depending when water goes back and forth. And now we found there's not just Vostok, there's a series of 142 lakes, and they change water between them. So the water will move to one. So it may not be as isolated as we thought, even though it is really central in the Antarctic continent and is a unique location. Another question? Mm-hmm.
A while back, I heard about the possibility of life on Jupiter and deeper in the atmosphere where it might be warmer and water might be present. Is that something that's still under consideration?
I've not heard of that with Jupiter, but I know that there are people looking at places like Venus, which is obviously very, very hot. But Venus and Earth are kind of twins in terms of size. And if Venus did have life before, and it has a kind of runaway greenhouse effect, it's very, very hot atmosphere now. If life was able to go up, at some point it's going towards outer space where it'll be very, very cold. So maybe you could have some microbes there. So some people are talking about aerobiology and looking further up. So it would be the equivalent of that. They're also looking at things like Titan, the moon of Saturn Saturn? Saturn? Moon of Saturn that is extremely cold and has methane lakes. And so they're trying to take it and wrap their head around, not that they think there'd be life there, and we wouldn't have to worry about planetary protection because nothing we know could ever live there. Planetary protection, we don't worry about it when we send things to Venus or to the sun, because anything would be totally cooked. So it's just the protection of not contaminating it. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if anybody has thought about actually introducing a replicator or an extremophile in probably a viable situation like Jupiter, life viable situation like Jupiter.
Some scientists have talked about that, and certainly if we start to do human missions where you've got to feed people, you're talking about introducing life up there. Chris McKay, who's an astrobiologist at Ames, NASA Ames in Mountain View, California, has been proposing the idea of flowers for Mars. And the Planetary Society and the Russians had a mission that didn't get beyond Earth orbit, but the idea was to send seeds out into space. But it was going to a moon of Mars, to Phobos. So our moon, we don't have the same planetary protection. If anybody proposed a mission to go to Mars with something that is a living organism for Earth, they couldn't do it right now because of planetary protection. So just like the moon, we'd want to have enough data to know that when we're sending something there, we're not going to interfere. But then you ask the question, for how long? So you start to see where it gets interesting. Any other burning questions? We'll do one more and then we'll get to this. Mm-hmm.
When you mentioned the SETI radio signals, were you speaking hypothetically, or as you mentioned, like the wave signals from away?
I'm sorry, can you repeat a little?
Sorry, when you were talking about the radio signals with SETI,
Mm-hmm.
were you speaking hypothetically?
Not at all. SETI is listening for signals all the time. We do not send signals, but
Are they getting signals?
they have not found any yet.
Oh, okay.
No, no, no.
I was just wondering.
So they've set up notions of what are the principles and policies that we should use if we get a signal. And actually, the astronomers have developed a set of steps. Basically, do good science, verify the frequencies, keep them open, share the information with everybody, notify the United Nations, and don't send signals back until we talk as humankind. But now there are people who are saying, let's do an active search. Let's send signals out. Well, who's to stop them? If you've got yourself a good telescope, you can do lots of things. And who's to say they can't do it? And is it illegal? Is it unethical? I don't know. Mm-hmm.
I have to ask, just because I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, have you run into any like radical opposition outside the scientific community yet?
Actually, it's even some of the questions are legitimate ones from the science community as well. Some scientific communities might ask, why are we doing this? Suggesting that it's, we don't need to, but basic science is basic science, and that's a different discussion about how you should do considerations of the types of science you do. The only areas where we have seen any kinds of opposition have been with launches of nuclear material. Now, this is not a nuclear reactor, but plutonium that acts as a heat source and then acts as a thermoelectric generator to keep the spacecraft going. And that works far longer and better than solar cells, which can get covered with dust on Mars and things like that. So the bigger missions, the further away missions, have nuclear material, and there's large numbers of people that are concerned about nuclear launches. Not for the science that they would do, but when they're coming by Earth, if anything would happen on the launch, that could be problematic. Although there's a lot of good data on the containment and the pellets and all of that, so there is data. And then with the Mars sample return mission, there was a group that was trying to stop it. They formed an organization called Group Against Mars Sample Return or something like that, International Group Against Mars Sample Return. And they were trying to use the microbe discussions to stop it. And it's unclear even whether there's something that was a bit shady. One of the guys wanted to work on the issue, and when he didn't get a job with NASA, he then went out and started all of this. But it's legitimate questions that would have to be addressed anyway in an environmental impact statement. So, but nobody is really trying to stop the mission so far. Mm-hmm.
Are there any international regulations on space travel or like restrictions on the kind of materials that you can, I mean, currently?
Are there any international restrictions or regulations on space travel?
Material that you can bring.
Okay, space travel and material that you can bring. At this point, the umbrella regulations are the UN Outer Space Treaty. What's interesting is for the past 4+ decades, that treaty is 67, all of the legal questions that have been on Earth orbit have been things like liability and help with astronauts and commercial space, orbits as an asset, satellites and liability as well as ownership. So they're all the kinds of things you'd still have on Earth. The only ones have been on the moon or further have been the scientists and the launching nations. So these questions are going to come up as these commercial groups push up there. So right now there is no issue. And what happened is when we had our ethics workshop, what we realized is the planetary protection guidelines apply to science missions. But the Outer Space Treaty also says that governments who sign it must oversee what gets done in space. And it applies whether or not a launch is by the government agency or a non-governmental entity. And right now there's a lot of people saying, I'm a private citizen, you can't tell me what to do. You can't tell me what I can launch into space. So they're getting FAA into it. They can give you a license to launch and land, but they don't tell you what to do when you're up there. So there's all these areas that are gaps. So there are gaps in policy, and so the kinds of questions you're asking about who sets regulations for what you can bring or what you can do, some of them have no answers yet. And that's why it's kind of fun to think about it, use astrobiology as a way to say, how do you go forward responsibly? Do we want to be proactive, or do we want to let something go ahead until an accident happens and then develop a policy, which we've often done? Mm-hmm.
One thing, you mentioned scientists and lawyers and their effect on missile regulations, but you didn't mentioned politicians, and since you spent so much time talking about the Mars program, could you talk about the current state of the United States Mars program? Because my understanding is it's taken a huge hit.
Right.
in that.
So the president's budget, I don't know the numbers offhand, but basically there's a 20% decrease in the funding available for planetary sciences. That's the basic sciences that we're all part of within astrobiology. And at the same time, there was a decommissioning of shuttle and the constellation program. So that took money out of making a new spacecraft to replace the shuttle. And what they did is they put that into commercial space. And so NASA is already even working with the commercial space entities, the private ones, and starting to increase its budget. So when you see what's available on the budget, you look at the ones commercial is got a big increase over where it was before. Planetary science has got a big decrease. And so people are concerned. That's why I'm saying on some of these issues, it means that if they're going to move ahead quicker with commercial space and using private spacecraft to get astronauts to the space station and then to get to the moon, now all of a sudden these issues become very real and near. The space sciences will be important for lots of reasons, but they'll keep going on, and people are asking to not cut it out. It just means so much about learning about ourselves and our planet and planetary processes. So that's an argument that's a political one. You're right. Mm-hmm.
Is there any current consensus on the ethics of, say, we found microbial life on Mars? Does that mean we're not then allowed to colonize Mars, terraform Mars, all those sort of things?
Those are good questions. When Carl Sagan was talking about, he said if we find life on Mars, even if it only is microbial, then Mars should belong to Martians.
But then what's particularly special about it?
That's the question that a scientist cannot answer, and the meaning of it. So that's why I'm seeing this, there's a need for folks to get involved in it. And when you ask theologians, or rather ethicists, about how we treat life, if you look at it, sentient life, human life, and now discussions about mammals and dolphins and other things, we're saying that these also have life and intelligence. So, and we also don't feed our pets or mistreat our food animals. So it doesn't mean you can't take them, sample them. But down on the other end of the extreme, when you think about microbes, how many people in here can say that they've never taken an antibiotic? How many people didn't brush their teeth this morning? We kill microbes and think nothing of it. Of course, we're not wiping out a species either, though. It would be just about impossible to eradicate it. So just because we take some microbes up there doesn't make it unethical. But then what does it mean if it's a different one? I don't know. So that's why those are not issues that a scientist can take on. I can tell you what the organism is, but how to treat it, that's something else. Mm-hmm.
So what are theologians saying about all this?
Theologians up until now have looked a lot at, and this goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas, and it really goes back deep into the church and to Plato and Aristotle. They looked more at sentient life. And there are some areas within religions, and it depends which religion you're talking about. The Judeo-Christian religions don't generally have any problems with a second Genesis, lowercase s and g. God created the heavens and earth, and it was good. And the idea that it would upset things is not a big problem. The problems I see is come when you're starting to talk about the particular dogma. I'm sorry if I'm using the words wrong, but so when you think about Judeo-Christian, so you go to the Bible, or you go to the Quran, or you go to some other books. When you do that, you start to say, well, did Jesus Christ come down on earth to save humankind? Are humans made in the image and likeness of God? Those are things that are tied to a religion that scientifically we may have some challenges. And so when I think about SETI type discoveries, those raise more religious issues, I think, than a microbial discovery. A microbial one raises ethical issues of the sort that fit into laws and policies. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think sentient beings are the places where I think the problems come in, and microbial ones are, I think, more of the ethical directions.
Yeah, ethical and, yeah. And also when we're thinking about these things, if you consider that we have bioethicists working with, say, the biomedical community, and decisions about experimental treatments or drugs or conflict of interest or whether you're making too much money from something. Whereas what we're talking about here is societal questions, not down at the individual level. And so we don't have the equivalent of an ethical system that deals with macroethics. How do you get a societal informed consent? I don't know. So those are the areas where I turn and say, we need help. And if the scientists don't think we need help, then they're misinformed as well. So education in this case goes in two directions, to the scientist as well as to the outside community to say, hey, these are interesting questions. You might want to look at them from your perspective. Mm-hmm.
I guess a related question might be the deep oceans where they're finding new species all the time. Are there rules to prevent,
Okay, our deep oceans, we find all sorts of new organisms as well. I started looking at Antarctic Treaty compared to Outer Space Treaty to see how we deal with biodiversity and use of the habitats and environmental management. And I'm thinking now that because the Antarctic Treaty is really for, it sets aside the Antarctic as a preserve for science exploration, and outer space is for science exploration, but also and use. And so it may be that the law of the sea is a better legal model to look at. So I'm starting to think about that a little bit. Because legally you have issues about mining of the deep seabed or oil and gas exploration. Well, there were proposals for oil and gas and mineral exploration in Antarctica, and the UN, it's not a UN treaty, but the group of scientists, they took care of that, and they said we'll have a 200-year moratorium on oil and gas and mineral exploration. That takes care of it. But UN is different. Mm-hmm.
Is it your impression that most of the motivation for such exploration comes from our desire to colonize or basic science, fundamental knowledge? Okay. You can personally, your own motivation.
Personally, for me, it's the fundamental basic knowledge, the basic science, with informed decision-making that goes with it. However, when you talk to the commercial folks, I mean, they're into it for going out there and getting resources. And already, this past week online, there were a flurry of op-eds and discussions because a lawyer wrote a op-ed about homesteading, saying that commercial space will never be able to make it to the next step without investors. And the investors aren't going to invest in anything if you can't have sovereignty up there or claim rights. If you're going to do some sort of mining, you want to be able to know that what you mine you can use, and so those things are not at all taken care of. And there are some people, in fact, this one op-ed ended with the idea that it's time that we moved beyond basically he was saying the silly science of the naive science of just going up there to look at it. We need to go use it. So do we go forth with this manifest destiny and go west, young man, or go up, young man, and do what you want, or do we try to think about it ahead of time?